Okay, thank you, Dr. Song. Good afternoon. After we enjoy very nice speech by Minister Yoon, and also we enjoy the good food, maybe you want to fall in sleep. But don't do that, because we have an exciting kind of topic to cover. This session will discuss on international trade, future of global trade. And as you know, WTO, since its birth, faces very serious crisis, as the Doha round, which was launched 12 years ago, never get any tangible result. Maybe we are expecting to have some agreement through this Bali ministerial conference to be held in December. But anyway, we also see TPP, RCEP, TTIP, many different regional trade agreements. So to be very frank, in terms of global trade environment, we are in a very uncertain and to somewhat chaotic kind of situation. We don't know which way we will be moving ahead. So this session is a very important session to see whether we can have some success at the MC9, or otherwise maybe we can go for more RTA directions. We have two prominent scholars for presentation. Professor Dr. Jeffrey Shedd from Peterson Institute and Dr. Yu from Peking University. So I will give 15 minutes for each presenter, and then that will be followed by two discussants. Professor Fukagawa from Waseda University, and Dr. Choi from Kiev will give about seven minutes each, so that we can have really time to interact between the speakers and floors. Okay, we changed the order a little bit, so we want to invite Dr. Yu first, so that and followed by Dr. Shedd. Okay, Dr. Yu, please.
Okay, so ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. So thank you so much for inviting me, and it's really my pleasure to be here. And also my congratulations to the IG's 20 years birthday. So here, what I'm trying to say is the future of global trade. So I would like to organize my talk as this way. First, review some important historical evidence, and then followed by the current trade performance, and then move to my predictions about future trade. And finally, talk about China's trade reality. So the first one, if we look at this one, we can see that international trade is very important. Especially in the last century. For example, before the World War I, we can see that many countries, indeed, their trade is so important. You can see that, for example, for the UK, their trade openness ratio is close to 30% before World War I. But because of the Great Depression in the 1929 to 1933, and also because of the World War II, so you see that it took many years to regain the same level of international trade. So the second one is we still understand international trade is very important to foster global economy. In particular, if we think about these figures, the world trade volume in 2011 is 18.2 trillion. So it surpassed the previous peak in the 2008. Then at that moment, the trade volume is 16.1 trillion. Also, today, it accounts for 1/4 of world gross products. So, in this sense, we say international trade is important. And if you look at this figure, you can see that. So, from here, in the last 2 decades, international trade increased from 100, suppose it's 100, is in the 1990, and in the last 2 decades to 300. So, it's 3 times increase. When we observe this, we ask this question: why trade increased so fast? Basically, for 3 reasons. Number one is because of the growing GDP. Suppose, the exporters are larger. They are able to produce more. And on the other hand, suppose importers are larger. They are able to buy more. So that's the first reason. And the second reason is because of the declining transportation costs. And the third reason is the trade liberalization. So which one is the most important? Bayer and Bertrand, they have one estimate. Using the European countries' data from 1958 to 88, they find that the growing GDP is the most important one, contribute 2/3 of the trade growth. And the other 1/3 contribute by both trade liberalization and also the trade, and also the declining transportation costs. But also we can see that trade liberalization is more important than the transportation costs. And we can see the same story from another side of the coin. For example, if you look at this, the Smoot-Hawley Act in the 1920s, you can see that it decreased trade quite large. Okay. So we ask a more fundamental question. Can international trade agreement help? And the answer say, well, in theory, yes. Why is that? For example, if you look at the Beckwell and Steger from Stanford's seminal work, you can see that, for example, without the international trade agreement, then two countries will reach a net equilibrium point, set a very high tariff at point N. But because of the WTO and also its previous gap, it will reduce to a lower tariff at point A. So then that means two countries also gain from trade. That is why international trade agreement help. So that's first observation. However, this is only from theory. From the empirical evidence, can we see this picture? Well, some people say yes, some people say not. For example, so the IMF people, Professor Sang Jin-wei, they found that yes, WTO will increase trade strongly but unevenly by industry and also by countries. However, Andy Rhodes from Berkeley said no, indeed, WTO didn't increase trade. Okay, so suppose he's correct. If WTO didn't increase trade, why trade grows so fast? Then there's only one possibility. That is because of the regional trade agreement. So we ask another question. What is the relationship between regional trade agreement and the WTO? Well, the point is, for the WTO, suppose we got three countries. If country A give country B, all WTO members, low tariff, then it must give another country the same lower tariff. However, there's only one exception. Suppose this country gives 0 tariff to another country. And this is exactly the point that the FTA pick up. Okay. And what we see is that then in the reality, what's the relationship between WTO and the regional trade agreement? We see that WTO, the Doha round is already, performed 10 years. Today is complete 80%, but for the rest 20%, it's very difficult to conclude, especially because they cover sensitive topics such as agriculture, intellectual property rights, and also the service industries. Therefore, on the other hand, you can see that, for example, regional trade agreement increased very fast. From the very early 1890s, Canada and US FTA to the NAFTA in 1994, and also to the recent ASEAN 10 plus China 1 here, and also the TPP, and also the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, and even now today, the ongoing China, Korea, and possible Japan's FTA. You will see that FTA move very fast. Okay. So when we observe this, we ask one more question. What is the relationship between WTO and RTA? Are they substitute or complement? Okay. So economists have different views on that. Some people say, well, it's substitute. Some people say it's complement. But the brief answer is say, well, depends on how the reality fit with the model. If the reality fit with the model of hetero-all-in model, then that means it's more inter-trade. For example, China export textile and the US export machinery. In this way, then they will be complement. But on the other hand, suppose say, well, China exports some part of machinery, but US also exports some part of machinery. That will be substitute. If you look at today's data, you will see that indeed, inter-trade is more important. Intra-trade only account for 1/4 of trade. So then that means RTA still is a complement to the WTO. Okay, and then moving to the current features of international trade, we say two guys are the most important one. So the first one is what we call is the trade integration, and another one is called production disintegration. So trade integration tells us, in the reality, even rarely a product is only produced by one country. We can think about the simple products such as the Barbie doll, and to the most complicated products such as iPhone. For example, the iPhone 4. So we can see that for the iPhone 4 indeed is produced by China for assembly, and for the US for sensors, and also for the European for the radio. So it's totally a global network of the value chain. So what I'm trying to say is, if you observe this, then you'll see that, well, the traditional trade aggregate statistic is misleading and somehow will generate undue controversy. For example, if you look at the iPhone 4, so you will say that, well, you will see China I mean, U.S. has a lot of trade deficit against China. However, if you would work on the value added, you will see that indeed such surplus come from the Japan and Germany and even South Korea. So indeed, I mean, from China is trade deficit. So what I'm trying to say is it's important to distinguish value added and export. Okay. So I have 4 predictions about future trade, 3 about firm's performance and 1 at the policy level. So the first one is about the firm's efficiency. So firm's efficiency is the most important to understand how trade work. And the brief answer is which firm can export and which firms can our FDI will depend on its productivity. If for low productivity guy, you will only able to serve in the domestic market, and if your productivity is higher, then you will serve in the both domestic market and export. Suppose your productivity is even higher, you will do domestic sale, export, and our FDI. If we understanding this point, so we can understand many Chinese firms, when they do our FDI, they lost the money because their productivity is not so high indeed. Okay. So the next part is the second prediction is about the correlation or the interaction between trade and finance will be more and more closely. Okay. So think about the recent financial crisis. Because of the recent financial crisis, trade collapsed in the 2008. And we got one paper to consider about the role of the credit constraint. And what we say is credit constraint play a role to affect firms' export. Compared to non-exporters, exporters, they are more credit constraint because they had to they had to bear the extra export fixed cost. They had to wait for the delayed payment and they faced higher trade uncertainty. Therefore, they are more credit constrained. Okay, so that is the second prediction. And the third prediction is when we open up, trade will no longer export so many products that will only focus on the product with their core competency. For example, suppose China reduce tariff, then foreign product will come to China's market. Therefore, the Chinese firm can only focus on their most core competency products. And the same reason, suppose say, well, the U.S. reduce its trade barriers. But it seems that it's easier for Chinese firm to export more. However, it may not. Because when U.S. reduce its tariff, then it also reduce tariff not only for China, but also for Mexico. Therefore, I mean, the Chinese product face tougher export competition as well. So that's my third prediction. So the last one is say about the global trade war. So thanks to the mutual understanding of the free trade for more than 200 years. So it seems that global trade war is avoidable. But what I'm trying to say is, well, maybe for the regional trade friction is unavoidable, or more precisely, we persist over years. When I say trade barriers, I'm not talking about tariff, I'm talking about non-tariff barriers, especially the anti-dumping, China special safeguard and safeguard. So there's one paper talking about the effect of this. So what I'm trying to say is, for example, consider this, the country A is US and the country B China. When US impose anti-dumping, country B, China will reduce its export to China. That's obvious. However, I mean, China will export its product maybe to other countries, to Europe or to the Japan. So that's another one. Okay, so what I'm trying to say is the whole world is interactive. Okay, so now let's move to my last part. It's about China's growing role in the world trade. So obviously China now is the country largest exporter in the world since 2009, surpassed Germany. Okay. And then it enjoyed the significant gains from trade, from the WTO, from the access to the WTO in 2001. So, and today is a very large open economy. Even due to the financial crisis, our opening ratio is higher than 50%, which is double than the US economy. Okay. So the last one is that we want to say purchasing trade is the most important one in China trade. Purchasing trade means we import raw material from abroad, and after local processing, we export the final product to the rest of the world. Okay. But what I'm trying to say is processing trade in the future is less important. Why is that? Well, we can see the data from here. We can see that indeed, I mean, the purchasing trade, this light tells us the ratio of purchasing trade. You can see that after 94 is higher than 50% in terms of the right-hand side scale. However, you can see that after 2001, the proportion is decreasing. Why purchasing trade is no longer important for China? Not so important for China. Because before we use purchasing trade is because we try to avoid the trade uncertainty. Because without WTO, each year we had to negotiate with the US or many other countries about the PNTR. However, with the purchasing trade, our product is guaranteed to sell to many places. In particular, because now we have already access to WTO, so per-session trade is no longer so important. That's my first observation. And the second observation is because of the weak external demand, so we will change the main export destination from the triad, EU, US, and Japan to the BRICS, to the new emerging economy, such as BRICS, especially Russia and probably Indonesia. Okay. So the second one is about if we don't rely on per-session trade, then what else would we try to rely on? We say we will work more to promote firms' R&D. But I would like to focus on this R&D is the process R&D, not the product R&D. Because compared to the product R&D, we still don't have a comparative advantage on working on that compared to the US or the EU countries. Okay. So basically this is and the last one is just about the trade liberalization in China over years, so I skip this. So briefly, let me summarize my talk. What I'm trying to say is, number one, further trade liberalization is needed to promote global trade. And the second one is the RTA seems to be an applicable and doable way to go. Suppose, the WTO didn't be so successful so far for the Doha round. And also another one is the vertical integration is a trend of future trade. And the firm selection is crucial. Also, trade and finance will interact more closely. And China will gain from trade as well as the world, as well as the rest of the world. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Yu. Can you come back later? I will give you the opportunity to ask, okay? I really thank you for your keeping the time to 15 minutes. So let me now introduce and invite second speaker, Dr. Jeffrey Schadt from Peterson Institute. Jeff, it's yours.
I'll bring my watch here, Teo, so I know what time it is. Good afternoon, and thank you very much for staying awake in this post-lunch session. I first want to extend my own personal congratulations to my very good friend Dr. Sagong and the IGE for their numerous achievements and successes over the past 20 years. Dr. Sagong made important contributions to the Peterson Institute, and we are very proud that he took inspiration from his tenure in Washington to establish the IGE. We know that the accomplishments of the IGE to date and the important work that it continues to do will be an enduring legacy for both Dr. Sagong and for the Korean people. And so I'm very proud and very honored to be invited to this conference. Now, the title of my presentation is Wither the World Trading System. We have just heard an excellent presentation on the evolving structure of trade. And indeed, trade has changed dramatically over the past few decades as a result of 8 successful rounds of multilateral trade negotiations. The world trading rules have been adopted in those rounds to provide some predictability for traders and investors to plan their business strategies and some insurance against protectionist impulses that can disrupt commercial relationships. And this has been a great success. And that's why I think we just heard that some of these trends are irreversible. But that assumes that the current status in the world trading system and of the world trading rules will be sustained. And I think that assumption is fragile at best. And the reason I'm a little bit worried is because the World Trade Organization is in trouble. And the success of the GATT era has not been replicated. There have been enormous improvements. There's been an expansion of the membership of the World Trade Organization, particularly with big countries like China and Russia. The dispute settlement system continues to work very well, adjudicating disputes and requiring compliance when countries run afoul of the rules. But the negotiating function have produced very limited results in the first 18 years of the GATT era, of the WTO era, and the dispute settlement mechanism is vulnerable to overload. The negotiations, while still alive, have effectively collapsed, and major trading nations have refocused their negotiating efforts on regional arrangements. It gets worse. So what's wrong with the WTO, and why has the negotiations failed? Well, I'm not a doctor, but I'll pretend to be one, at least a trade doctor, to explain what I think has been wrong in the WTO system. Now, I hesitate to perform a full autopsy while the patient is not yet clinically dead, though I suspect there were multiple causes ranging from malnutrition, which you could call a lack of political will, and many people have talked about that already today. There were self-inflicted wounds. Some call that shooting yourself in the foot, but there were tactical blunders throughout the course of the Doha round that led to negotiating stalemates and new and augmented protectionist policies that made it much more difficult to move forward with a trade liberalization agenda. I think the patient was also poisoned by some of the member countries through either deliberate foot dragging by those seeking to implement not wanting to implement trade reforms in their own country. And so there was a deliberate attempt to sabotage. And finally, I'd say you'd have to talk about xenophobia. It certainly would be a factor into the full psychological profile of the patient, but there were a number of countries that faced significant competition because of the introduction of China into the world trading system, and were concerned about, at least in their own marketplace, committing to new trade reforms that would only exacerbate that competition. So as a result, WTO negotiators never really pursued what they said they were pursuing in every communique that came out of WTO ministerial, and that was a Doha package that was ambitious and balanced. So what is the cost of the of this failure of the Doha round? I'd say, first of all, that well, let me take a step back. The Doha round is near collapse, but it's not the first multilateral negotiation to collapse under the weight of substantive disputes and tactical negotiating blunders. Almost every round has done that in the post-war era. But it well could be the first multilateral negotiation that could not be revived and brought to a successful conclusion. And that, I think, is the source of concern, and that could lead to serious damage for the World Trade Organization as an institution. So the cost of failures can be summarized like this. The institutional cost. The failure of a Doha round would lead to a reluctance to pursue new multilateral initiatives going forward. Even though WTO members would still be bound by their existing obligations, and the WTO's dispute settlement mechanism would still continue to operate, I think there'd be a lot of reluctance to invest more in going to Geneva, spending more time and effort if talks that lasted a decade and produced nothing were likely to be replicated in the future. That's a serious problem, and I note that in some very senior officials in key countries who don't want to go to Geneva anymore. Because they say, why bother? People don't go there to do business anymore. And that was the hallmark of the GATT era. People went to the GATT to do business and get things done. They made compromises and they produced results. That doesn't seem to be the attitude of negotiators who go to Geneva in the WTO. The second concern is that over time, if you have a frozen legislative function, a frozen negotiating function in the WTO, that will erode political support for compliance with the judicial function of the WTO. Because without the prospect of new negotiations to update and clarify the WTO rulebook, disputes will increasingly arise in the gray areas of WTO law, and panelists will be tempted to bridge the gaps in their rulings. And such interpretations of how WTO provisions under dispute could be applied would establish new WTO case law that over time would expand the scope of WTO obligations. Panelists effectively would be deciding what trade negotiators had been unable to resolve, and that would likely cause a lot of heartburn among legislatures and particularly members of the U.S. Congress. And the third problem is the expansion of discriminatory trading arrangements. We've seen a huge proliferation of agreements. There are lots of these PTAs. Actually, few of them really make a difference or have a substantial impact on trade and investment. Many of them just codify existing policies and exempt reforms that political leaders don't want to address. Agriculture and services receive token attention, and national restrictions are left largely unfettered. Investment reforms, if covered at all, avoid strictures on national champions and the preferential policies that support them and obstruct competition in the marketplace. So that is the body. If you're thinking about preferential trading arrangements and they're having 300 of them, most of them don't worry about. They really don't have much impact on business or on the system. But over the past 5 years, major trading nations have been hedging their bets because of the weakness in the WTO talks, and they've been pursuing parallel negotiations on mega-regional pacts involving multiple partners and representing a significant share of global output and trade. These mega-regionals, which Minister Yoon talked about in his luncheon address, are in particular the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, and the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership in Asia. Now, you can see they involve a lot of countries, a large aggregate share of global GDP and exports. But the problem with these three mega-regionals is that many poor countries, especially in Africa, South Asia, and Latin America, are not involved and risk further marginalization if these pacts continue to move and the multilateral system does not progress. So there's a need to find a way to rechannel these important liberalization initiatives back to the WTO. So how do you do this? Well, I think there are two options for moving forward in the multilateral system. And this is my hope for reviving multilateral, the WTO system, before it crumbles completely. Plan A is the most direct one. It involves moving forward with the work that is now underway and accelerating in the WTO to try to produce at least a minimum package of agreements at Bali. The minister talked about that at lunch. But trade facilitation is a critical component of that. And there has to be enough agreed to at Bali so that there is a confidence that countries can get something done in the multilateral negotiations and are thus willing to invest more in going back to Geneva and building on the Bali package to produce a much broader trade agreement. That would involve yielding working on new plurilaterals beyond the trade facilitation, new services agreement, the second stage of an information technology agreement that would expand the agenda and the possible gains that could come out of a WTO negotiation. Now note, I don't call this a Doha round negotiation because it would be much broader than the issues that were discussed in the Doha round. It would have to be, because the Doha round didn't produce the ambitious and balanced enough result to allow a deal to be put together and ratified and implemented. So you need to supplement it with these plurilaterals. Bali is providing a partway, at least a possible start to getting there. And if that works, then you can think about a direct route back to Geneva to restart and reinvigorate WTO negotiations. Critical to this, I think, is the services agreement. The Chinese have asked to join those talks, and if they come in with very constructive and comprehensive offers to open up services, it will put a great deal of pressure on India to follow suit, and that would really open the door for a broader services negotiation in Geneva as originally contemplated at the start of the Doha round. But that may not happen because of all of the things that ail the system that I mentioned earlier are still not there, particularly the lack of political will. So then we go to Plan B. And these are not mutually exclusive, but two different ways that the same result could be achieved. And Plan B is going from mega-regional to multilateral. And we already see the components of that coming together. The TPP-12 that are already account for almost 40% of global GDP. The likely expansion of that group over the next couple of years, once the TPP deal is completed, which I forecast will likely occur in the first half of 2014. If you add Korea, Indonesia, Thailand, and the Philippines, countries that have already expressed strong interest in the TPP, you suddenly have a very big agreement. And even the Chinese are now doing a lot of work, due diligence on what is in the TPP and thinking about joining the TPP over the medium term. At the same time, you have the intra-Asian negotiations going on. But the interesting thing is those negotiations are on a much slower timetable. So you're not likely to see much results in the RCEP or the China, Japan, Korea negotiations for several years. And when you do, it's going to be a lower level of agreement in terms of scope of liberalization and depth of reform than you will see in the TPP. And at the same time, you have the transatlantic deal going forward, and links to the transatlantic deal through the agreements that the EU is negotiating, has negotiated with Korea and with Japan, is negotiating now with Japan. So you see a system of major trade agreements that are linking the mega-regionals through important bilateral agreements. Korea is at the center of many of those, and providing a possible way of bringing together the mega-regional deals that have a very similar objective and table of contents. They are all comprehensive in scope. They are all seeking deep reforms across goods and services and investment. And they all could come together in a couple of years and link into the plurilateral agreements that are moving forward on the direct line, on Plan A, to find a way back to Geneva. Because we all know that if you want to have a secure global trading system, it needs to be inclusive, it needs to take care of the developing countries, and it needs to be equitable among the 160 countries or so. So that's the first half of my presentation. I just said that to scare our chairman. Let me turn to the last slide. So the conclusions and the points to take away. He breathes a sigh of relief. That the WTO is in deep trouble, and there are costs to letting it continue to drift. So the successful conclusion of multilateral negotiations are crucial to the well-functioning world trading system. And there are two pathways to do that. They're not mutually exclusive, but they involve putting together what I would call a WTO recovery package through either direct negotiations to get back to Geneva, or through a consolidation of the mega-regionals. But you're talking about a Doha plus agenda, not the narrow talks that broke down in Geneva back in 2008. And the key thing is that much of what is being negotiated was built by the architects of the Korea-U.S. Free Trade Agreement. And much of what is the standard now for the international trading system is that Chorus FTA. So perhaps Korean and American architects can help build a new wing of the WTO. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jeff. You keep the time also to the limit. But I gave you 2 more minutes, so that's fine. Now we want to go to the discussion. Professor Fukagawa, and then Dr. Choi later.
Well, thank you, Chairman. This session is the competitions to keep the time, so I'm afraid I won't be able to keep this pace. Well, I have a short comment on the what has been discussed both by Professor Hughes and Jeff. And well, there seems to be a consensus for free trade. Well, even though everybody's suffering after the global crisis since 2008, but still many countries are striving to push forward the free trade agreement, well, in different kinds. But there seems to be a discrepancy between the speed that the financials and capital market will be able to adjust and the speed in the real sector. So even in the U.S., employment seems to be very sticky, and it would take time to adjust the real sector. And so in the meantime, almost everybody is suffering from the cost for the democracy because the employment is sticky and political constraints exist all there. And that was the major discussions during the morning. But what is happening, especially in just watching the Asia-Pacific regionalism, especially, is that there seems to be a question that, well, we've been talking about the tariff because tariff is, of course, the central part of the free trade negotiation. But there's a question: if we just stick into the tariff and we said we have a high standard FTA, we put the oil tariff into zero, but if after all the political and social constraint, if the countries dare to keep the special arrangement like special barriers like photosanitary inspection measures, intellectual property rights, safety standards, environment protections, that may be even more destructive for the free trade. The tariff is quite simple. If you pay the tariff, still you can export the goods to you, but if you're not products are not satisfying the SBS standards, and the standards is always changing, that might be another way of protectionism. So we have to tackle with these issues. And the other thing is, as Jeff has already mentioned, there can be some sectoral approach towards the free trade, like IT products and IT tariff reductions. But there seems to be another difficulties even in sectoral approach. Well, probably automobile might be the typical difficult industries for the free trade negotiation, and what stands out in the automobile industries is the major companies are quite monopolizing the global trade. So how we can deal with the sectoral approach is another issues. And I would like to touch upon something about Japan-Korea-China FTA that is regarded as a kind of mega FTA, but we are quite behind. And maybe Korea and China bilateral negotiation will find a breakthrough, but we don't know. And so far, Japan-Korea-China FTA has been somewhat far behind, even compared with the ASEAN in a driving seat. And some people say that we are totally lacking in any kinds of political will, or some people criticize that we don't have any common goal, even though the ASEANs as the groups of relatively minor economies, but they have their common goals that we have to integrate. Otherwise, all the FDI will be absorbed by China's and we won't be able to survive. Or maybe their market, some people say, oh, the market is functioning well, so we don't have to institutionalize the FTA. But there should be a lot of things that we have to do. And there seems to be some diverging interest among Japan, Korea, China. Japan, as time goes by, has been sticking to the FDI values, a supply chain network, and that's why we have started to show more interest in a plurilateral approach rather than bilateral approach. And Korea has been always trying to lead the bilateral negotiations and trying to make an FTA hub. And China seems to be more interested in securing resource and preventing trade friction. So they have a very different interest. But there seems to be still another rounds of discussions among the Japan, Korea, China. Probably as time goes by, China's and Korea's is catching up with the industrial structures in Japan. And the question is whether the postponing of the time is friends for us or not. As time goes by, industrial structures tends to converge, and there can be even more difficult, especially politically, socially difficult process for industrial adjustment. So that's one thing. And also, as we are all the parties of aging societies, and many people are so much afraid of losing job at this moment. So how we can rationally deal with the industrial adjustment, trying to smoothly kicking out the losers out of the market is another thing. And also we have, unfortunately, as a big traditions of industrial policies, government is always tends to intervene into the market process. So my suggestions for CJK FTA is taking another kind of combination between, as Jeff mentioned, like a plan A, combinations of plan A and plan B. Probably we should spend more energy into a trade facilitation because we have a lot of things to do that we can start from right now, like trade enhancing and logistic of this kind of issues. And that can be even promoted by exchanging the professionals, and that is going to provide transparent standard, etc. And another cooperation is the common goal should be how we can make the best use of such a common accumulations of the industries that is very much sophisticated, globally very high standard of technologies, etc. So service and SME might be the strategic part, and local to local because we are the local members anyway. And the deregulations and competition policy studies might be the crucial part of Plan A and Plan B combinations. And in addition, as Professor Yu pointed out, macroeconomic dialogue should be continuous because there's always some competitions, especially in manufacturing sectors. The currency war is very dangerous for us, so we have to keep up the dialogue, and that's one thing. And also, finally, the movement of natural persons, including the professionals, networks for the accountabilities, like even the government, IPR protections, SPS, environment, and those kind of things could be probably effectively depoliticized if we try to cooperate even seriously. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Kagawa. Now I'll invite Dr. Choi from Kiev. He's a senior research fellow at Kiev. I give you 7 minutes.
Okay, thank you, Chairman. I'm honored to deliver my views on the future of global trade at this excellent international conference, and I also congratulate the 20th anniversary of IGE. The speakers and the discussants discussed the various topics, including the multilateral trading regime and FTA and processing trade. I'd like to begin by briefly sketching the current landscape of world trade. World trade has increased by about 8.8% annually during the last 2 decades. When we exclude the economic shock in 2009, the annual growth rate was 10.4%, which means that the trade has played a role of growth engine, reflected in the world GDP that increased by 2.4%. When you look into the geographical distribution of trade, it turned out that the share of the developed economies dropped from 64% in 2001 to 50% in 2011, while those of BRICS plus mixed countries increased from 14% to 24%. Let's review the causes behind the rise of the global value chains. The rise of the global value chains has been fueled first by the trade in intermediate goods, facilitated and accelerated by the intra-industry trade and global outsourcing. And second, by expanded foreign direct investment and offshoring. And third, trade cost reduced by the trade liberalization. We calculated the upstreamness index as an indicator to show the location of upstreamness in the global value chains. It is notable that it increased substantially during the period from 1996 to 2009. Specifically, the indexes for East Asia and the rest of the world turned out to have increased rapidly. The OECD shows that the final price of the product varies depending on the number of production stages and the value of the tariff. In highly fragmented production processes, seemingly small tariffs add up to very high cost. For example, a 5% tariff leads to a 25% increase in the price of the final good, while a 20% tariff would increase the same price by 160%. So, summing up, the recent trade patterns have been transformed from trade in goods to trade in tasks. So, global trade liberalization is urgently needed as the rise of the global value chains magnifies the economic cost of trade barriers. Specifically, it is necessary to harmonize the border measures, including standard, SPS, and TBT. So, I'd like to turn to the DDA negotiations. But the DDA negotiations have been stalled by the conflicting interests of major players, as Dr. Schott already pointed out. I have a more realistic viewpoint about the Bali conference. When we analyze the GDP effects of the Doha round on major economies, the simulation result belongs to the range of economic gains produced by the previous literature. But the economic impacts for the European Union and the United States turn out to be marginal compared to those for China and India. That means that the expected benefits for each WTO member will be dependent on the issues to be discussed in the negotiations. I believe the causes behind the current stalemate of the Doha round are, number one, by the power shift from the old Quad countries to the new G7 countries. And number two, the economic factors which I explained using the simulation results. So, if the WTO members cannot fully agree to the multilateral agreements, the sectoral and the plurilateral agreement will be a good option in terms of saving time for non-member countries to adapt themselves to new trade agreements such as anti-counterfeiting trade agreement and TISA, ITA2, and so on. In addition, US President Obama already proposed plurilateral agreement regarding environment goods in June of this year. I think that there is a good idea to incorporate such new trade issues into multilateral trade forum. The sectoral and plurilateral agreements in the WTO are expected to be stepping stones for multilateral agreements, as Dr. Schott already pointed out. So I'd like to turn to the next issue of regional trade agreements. I think that the plurilateral RTAs, including TTIP, TPP, EU-Japan FTA, and RCEP are good for not only global value chains, but also multilateral rulemaking regarding rules of origin, SPS, and standards. In that sense, I agree to Dr. Schott's idea about Plan B. FTA rules of origin, which are different from each other, can be harmonized by participating in bilateral FTA agreements, and thereby reducing spaghetti war effects resulting from the bilateral FTAs. But the RTS should be consistent with the WTO and get Article 24 so that the bilateral review and monitoring system must be facilitated by the Committee on Regional Trade Arrangements. We also need midterm solutions to revitalize the WTO. In this respect, the WTO dispute settlement mechanism must be equipped with a kind of binding legal system. A former chairperson of DSP, Mr. Bashir, estimated the compliance rate in the DSP to be 90% last year, but it is widely viewed that the WTO dispute settlement mechanism need to be developed fully with respect to transparency and efficacy. Finally, the WTO should strengthen its role as a part of a new global governance that is a partner to the G20, IMF, and World Bank. Specifically, it should cooperate with other international organizations in order to deal with the development issues, which have been very crucial for successful completion of the DDA negotiations. Okay, due to the time constraint, I'll stop now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Choi. We are given 70 minutes for this session. We started at 2:40, so this session will continue until 3:50. What I want to do is that I want to collect the questions and then maybe 3 or 4 questions together, and then let the speakers respond. And if you have time, we have another round. But the speakers, if you have if you want to respond to the commentators, then maybe you can include that too when you speak. Okay, first of all, the gentleman want to ask one question. Please identify yourself very briefly, and then you give a very brief question or comment.
My name is Chunyan Kim. I'm Vice Chairman of Korea ABC here in Seoul. My first question is to Mr. Yu, is just a clarification. What do you mean by processing trades? I would like to know. And second question is more substantive one to Mr. Schott. We are all talking about the lack of progress on the multinational agreements. Ever since the Uruguay round, nothing has been agreed upon. Now, Professor Bagwadi had a hands-on the answer. He says 200 nations have to agree on all the issues, and each issue covering thousands of pages. Most of the nations do not have manpower or ability to even read through the items, let alone to agree. And here we have a situation there's absolutely no possibility of making any progress. So why do we make a pretense of trying to do anything with the systematically impossible multinational agreements? Thank you.
Okay. Any questions or comments from the floor?
Yeah, I also have a question. Guntram Wolf from Bruegel. I also have a question for Jeff Schott on the kind of the stepping stone theory. I mean, how realistic is it really that we move from several super regional RTAs, regional trade agreements, to some form of a multilateral scheme? Because at the end of the day, I mean, we are now not talking about lowering of tariffs. We are talking about very, very complicated regulatory measures that are, of course, done with very specific interests in mind, and that could exclude actually major economies that are not covered in those RTAs. And perhaps you can also enlarge a little bit on your point. You made the point that some less developed economies, such in Africa and so on, would be hurt by those RTAs. I didn't really get the point, because I mean, at the end of the day, if you reach an RTA with the same regulatory standards, it opens up more export possibilities, because the market that can be reached is going to be bigger, while the regulatory standards may not hurt those economies in the first place, because it's a very different segment of the market. Thank you.
Thank you. I want to have one more question, if you have, from the floor. If not, okay.
Inbom Choi with General Motors. Question for Jeff. In your grand scheme of Plan B, having or combining TPP and TTIP and RCEP and whatever have you there in your chart, that still leaves most of Latin American countries and Africa, except probably a couple in Latin America, right? So how would you address that in the big picture of global trade, the system?
Okay, we have enough questions, but 3 questions to Jeff and 1 question to Dr. Yu. And I also give some time to Professor Fukagawa and Dr. Choi to respond to any of the, the comments. So I will start with Dr. Yu. You have a microphone.
Okay, so thank you for the question. About the processing trade, it means we import raw material from other countries, and then after local processing, you export the final product to the other countries. For example, we can give 2 examples. One is the Barbie doll. So Barbie doll, basically we got the material from Taiwan or from Singapore, and then we got the local process in China, and then we export to the US. That's number 1. And the second one is about iPhone. For the iPhone, basically what we have is we get the key components from Korea and also say from the US and EU. But then again, we assembly in China and export to the rest of the world. So this is about processing trade. Yeah. Okay. Oh, okay. So briefly, we got 2 types of processing trade in China. The 2 most important one is called processing with assembly, and another one is called processing with imported input. So for processing with assembly, then basically that means we sign the contract with the foreign provider, and then you don't need to provide any money when you have such product. What you need to do is with a contract. But then with this type of processing trade, you have to sell your product back to the same company, to the same country. This is called processing with assembly. And it was popular in the 1980s. And the second one called processing with inputs. So we can import, for example, material from Korea, but then we assembly and then we export to the US or other countries. So this one is the most important one, called processing with inputs. Thank you. And also thank you so much for the 2 discussions. I really enjoyed it. No.
Thank you, Dr. Schott.
Well, thank you. Like Dominique Strauss-Kahn this morning, I would need 10 or 15 minutes for each of these good questions, but I'm not going to be given that, so I will give just a very, very incomplete answer. On the first one, I've been arguing and discussing with Jagdish Bhagwati for 25 years about these issues. But the current situation in the WTO is one where, yes, there are resource constraints for some of the poorest countries, but even though there are almost 160 countries in the WTO, only 10 or 15 are really negotiating and being asked to make important changes in their policies. The other countries should make important changes in their policies, but they're not going to be required to by these agreements. So it's not a question of having too many members. It's a question of the major trading countries, both developed and developing, having the political will to compromise and reach an agreement. And for that, you need a broad-ranging agenda to cover the priority issues of those countries, which is why the Doha round didn't work when it was focusing on just agriculture and light manufacturers. The next 2 questions I think I can group together because it's really about using a stepping stone approach. Frankly, I don't think these mega regionals are going to go as deeply into regulatory matters as you think. I think there's going to be a limit to that. Most of the time, trade agreements establish processes for allowing greater transparency and introduction or participation in regulatory processes, but they don't involve setting those regulatory standards or leading to convergence or harmonization of those standards. The TTIP is trying to do more. it's not going to get very far. Now, Imbaum asked about how do you bring these three mega regionals together. Well, you don't try to converge, have a harmonization of the three mega regionals, because that won't work. TPP countries will not dilute the TPP to go to the lower standards and exceptions that will be in RCEP. There will be substantial similarities between the TPP and the transatlantic, but for the purpose of using these mega regionals to try to establish a new agenda for the WTO, you want to basically take precedents from each of these three agreements and move them forward to a broader multilateral agenda. So basically supplement the multilateral agenda by things that are already being done, where precedents have already been established in the mega regionals. And I think that's important. A lot of countries are going to be excluded from these mega regionals, and they suffer traditional trade diversion and investment diversion. That's where they're getting hurt right now. Take an example, Taiwan. Taiwan is out of most of the arrangements in the region, and they're frankly getting screwed. And they're getting cut out of the global supply chains because they're not in these agreements. So the idea is to get back to Geneva, where you don't have that type of traditional trade diversion. I'll leave it at that, though that's a very incomplete answer to those three good questions.
Thank you, Jeff. I would like to invite Fukagawa. If you have anything to say further, then you can say briefly.
One question to Professor Yu. Actually, when I were cooperating with Japan, Korea, China FTA talk, one time I was asking about the possibility of the Jeff's Plan A approach in Korea, Japan, Korea, China FTA. And at that time, Chinese side was extremely negative about service trade, as well as the, even the dialogue about the currency issues. But since then, well, 10 years, more than 10 years have passed, and situations have changed a lot. And of course, China seems to be very much interested in service sector productivities in terms of employment. And of course, China wished to internationalize further the yuans and the settlement, especially in terms of the trade. So my question is whether there is any possibility to go for a new Plan A CJK approach.
So this is a very nice question. Thank you. And then my response is right. So we already got 10 years to change, right? So the situation 10 years ago is different from what we have today. So service trade before was not so important for China's trade, and currently, I guess, also account for around 10% of China's current trade. And that's the first point. And the second point is the service industry in China, different from other rich countries. So service industry, the proportion of service industry is only 42%, last year. So what I'm trying to say is service industry will be more and more important, but at this moment, it's not the most important one. China, still has competitive advantage on its manufacturing sectors. And then when we talk about the free trade agreement, I think it's really good to, to move forward from manufacturing trade to service trade, but it takes time. Thank you.
Thank you. I want to invite Dr. Choi. I'll give only 1 minute because we are almost done.
One comment from the floor was that it would be very difficult for maybe 150-something countries to find out some solution in the Doha Development Agenda negotiations. I fully agree with that, but I think that we need to think about how to revise current, the decision-making process. For example, the WTO has taken one vote for one single country system, and it also takes a consensus system. But how about the World Bank and IMF? They took weighted voting system. So we need to think about revise the current WTO rule-making or consensus-building system. That's my.
Thank you very much, Dr. Choi. We'd like to conclude this session. I'll just make 1 minute statement. This is very interesting time because we are looking, forward to the Bali MC9 meeting to be held in 1 month's time. So maybe we can talk about this plan A and B kind of thing, but after December 9th, then maybe plan B become plan A. We have to think about plan C. I don't know what will happen. So maybe we have to gather once more to talk about, what will be going on, the WTO and multilateral trading system. Well, let me conclude, but before I do that, let me join other speakers, other people in congratulating Dr. Sagong and IGE for its 20th active work and anniversary. Thank you very much for this wonderful occasion. I will conclude this session. Please join me in thanking the panelists.